Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S down to C tier for patch 11.2. This is the first tier list for the newly released set 4.5. Overall, there's a healthy amount of diversity in synergies being used, though there's clearly a few that stand out above the rest. Keep in mind that a new B patch came out that may change the meta. We'll have to wait and see how the meta evolves over the next few days to know the full impact of these changes. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, we have the synergies in the S tier. This consists of Elderwood, Mage, Keeper, Vanguard, and Blacksmith. These synergies have a lot of influence on the current meta and are used consistently most games. At the top of the S tier, we have Elderwood. Elderwood has been dominating the current meta with a mixture of Elderwood champions and Aurelion Sol. Specifically, Rakan has been a huge boon to the Elderwood trait alongside of Xayah. But the B patch has addressed how strong Rakan is, which may end up hurting the composition overall. Despite those nerfs, a large reason as to why Elderwood does well is how strongly Aurelion Sol pairs with the synergy. Aurelion wasn't nerfed much, so Elderwood should still be strong in the meta, just not as dominant in the mid game as it was prior to the hotfix. Next up is Mage. Mage is doing well entirely because of Aurelion Sol. Sure, there's some reroll compositions that can do well, but in general the focus when using Mage as a trait is on A-Sol. The reason for this is that his ability procs additional damage the second time he hits an enemy champion with his ultimate. It's a lot of extra damage, which means you always want to be running Mage with Aurelion. A-Sol basically has the opposite issue that Ahri had, where he relies heavily on Mage, where Ahri never really needed it to do well. Keeper has been a top synergy mainly because of Rakan and Xayah. Those two paired together fit so well with Elderwoods that Keepers rose up a lot in value. But with nerfs to Rakan in the B patch, this may lower how much value players put on Keeper moving forward. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out, but at the end of the day, Rakan and Xayah are still going to pair well together, which gives your board Keeper. The surprise of the patch is Vanguards. Vanguards struggled a lot in the original set 4 because a lot of the damage was magic based. But in 11.2, the trait now provides extra magic resist to Vanguard's champions, which means they aren't completely useless into magic damage. In addition to this change, there's a lot of emphasis on crowd control for Vanguards with the introduction of Nautilus and Ornn. Plus, Aatrox has been buffed several times, so now you've got a wide variety of frontliners to choose from that are both defensive and bring good crowd control to your board. Since we've mentioned him, let's go ahead and talk about Ornn's trait, Blacksmith. Ornn doesn't always find a place in late game builds, but during the late stages of the mid game, it's common to see most players pick up and play Ornn. This is because the trait Blacksmith provides additional items known as artifacts. These artifacts generally provide a large boost in stats with additional effects. Because of how valuable these artifacts are, it means that Ornn is always worth playing, at least until he generates 1 or 2 artifacts. That's going to be it for the S tier, so let's move on now to the synergies in the A tier. This tier consists of Executioner, Slayer, Brawler, Warlord, Ninja, Spirit, Mystic, and Daredevil. These synergies are commonly used in top 4 comps and are all around consistently useful. Up first for A tier, we have Executioner. This is one of the new traits added in 4.5, and it's doing quite well with multiple compositions built around either Kayle as the carry or Xayah. Kayle in particular feels quite strong when you get the right items and have a strong board to assist her. Overall, it's not the flashiest of synergies, but it does add a lot of extra damage to its champions, so it's almost always being used when running either Kayle or Xayah as the primary carry. Slayer has a similar concept as Executioner since it's used to buff up certain carry champions. Most notably, you're going to see Olaf use the trait, but Zed also makes use of it in builds where he's the carry, and late game you can always pick up Samira. Zed was nerfed in the new B patch, and that may lower his value as a Slayer carry, though Slayer as a whole will still be doing well in the new meta. Brawlers are doing quite well in the meta after the changes introduced in 11.2 that provides them with extra attack damage on top of the increased health. This means their early game impact, which was already quite good prior to this, has gone up a lot. Later on in the game, you're mainly going to use them with Elderwoods, but there's some niche compositions using Shyvana as a carry with Brawler as the main synergy. But if you're wanting to get the most value out of Brawlers, we recommend using them early to mid game before transitioning into a more solid frontline like Elderwood or Vanguard. Next, we have Warlords. Warlords were doing alright in 11.1, but they received substantial buffs in 11.2 that increased their consistency by a lot. In the current meta, they're one of the stronger 6-piece traits thanks to those buffs, plus Tryndamere does well as a secondary carry for the comp. One of the best aspects of this trait is that you can always just use them for their mid-game power spike and then transition into a different comp later on. Ninjas are back and doing well in the meta mainly because of Zed, though Zed did receive a nerf in the hotfix to his tier 3 ability. This may cause Ninja and Zed comps in general to fall down in value. Kali is also a viable carry for this trait, and Shen is still a strong frontline, so even if the Zed nerf does end up being impactful, it shouldn't make Ninja as a trait unplayable. Up next, we have Spirit. Spirit is finally back to being a real trait after it was reworked to be a flat percentage in increased attack speed instead of being tied to the champions of mana pool. Along with that, Diana was turned into a Spirit, which has opened up the door to several compositions using her, Spirits and Assassins. It's nice to see the trait doing well, though it may be a bit too good as a companion trait for carries like Zed. Sadly, Mystic has fallen out of the S tier. While it's still a fantastic splash trait that many players will add to their composition, the impact it has on your board is far less in 4.5 than it was in the base set 4. The reason is there's quite a lot of physical damage in the meta, and quite frankly, the trait doesn't help as much against the damage of units like Aurelion Sol. But don't let this dissuade you from using Mystic, as it's still one of the best splash traits in the game. And the last trait for A tier is Daredevil. Daredevil, or Samira, is a fantastic late game champion that is a bit overshadowed by the current dominance of Aurelion Sol. Mainly, you're going to use her in Slayer-focused compositions. But once Aurelion Sol is toned down, it's likely we'll see more of a shift back into 5-cost late-game carries, and Samira is one of the strongest, especially after Yone was nerfed. Let's move on to the B tier synergies. This tier consists of Duelist, Divine, Exile, Adept, Siphoner, Assassin, the Boss, Emperor, and Fabled. Overall, these synergies are capable of doing well in the current meta, but for the most part are just average at best. At the top of B tier, we have Duelist. Duelist as a composition is still doing the same it was previously. It does well early game, it can have a decent mid-game power spike, and tends to get outscaled in the late game. The main thing regarding Duelist that has changed is that you can use a spatula item to turn Kayle into a Duelist. This build variation helps the trait out a lot in terms of scaling into the late game. Another trait used by Kayle is Divine. Divine doesn't really have much of a place in the meta besides being used for Kayle. That said, it is an important aspect for Kayle-focused compositions. For that reason, it's a lot more valuable than it otherwise would be. With the B patch, we've decided to move Exile further up in B tier. Originally, it was at the end, but Yone did receive a decent buff to his armor and magic resist shred. Due to this buff, it's likely that Yone will see more late game play, and thus Exile will be more relevant. And of course, Yasuo in the early game also adds value to the trait, since he's one of the better chosen champions that you can get in Stage 2. Alongside Exile, we have Adept moving up from our original placement on the tier list, though not by much. Adept is mainly having issues being relevant in the meta, as attack speed slow isn't as impactful on certain carries like Olaf or Aurelion. But it's still a useful splash trait that will become more common now that Yone has received a buff. Siphoner is a new trait that adds healing to your board, much like Celestial from set 3. The champions are all around solid, and it's easy to splash the trait into multiple comps. What holds back the trait is mainly that the healing provided often isn't impactful enough, especially against compositions using Aurelion Sol that burst champions down. Assassin is at an odd place because there are several comps that utilize Assassin champions and the trait itself. But the trait itself isn't providing nearly as much as other traits, plus the champions themselves only really need it for the boost in critical damage and having access to the backline. It's not a bad trait by any means, but neither is it that great. The Boss is doing well enough in the meta since it's possible to toss Set into an Elderwood comp. There's also a lot of champions with high health, which increases his value in late game boards. But he's not as valuable as other 5-cost champions, so finding use for him can be difficult. Set is good, just not always good enough. Emperor is a trait that's still just okay. Azir as a champion, though, is great. Azir brings a ton of value to late game boards, especially with Elderwoods and Keeper being top tier. That said, his Sandguards are still lackluster and even slightly outclassed by the addition of the Training Dummy consumable. Fabled is another new trait added in 4.5, and while it has its place in the meta with Vanguard Mystic, it's difficult to always find value from the trait. Cho'Gath is easily the best of the 3 champions, but fitting in all 3 into a composition can be difficult. Overall, it is a strong trait, but it's just a bit niche in where you can utilize it. And now we move on to our last tier, the C tier. This consists of Dragon Soul, Sharpshooter, Enlightened, Fortune, and Cultist. These synergies are useful in the right situation, but have less of an impact on the meta than the tiers above them. Up first, we have the newly added Dragon Soul. This trait seems like it should be more prominent considering how common Aurelion, Olaf, and Swain are, but so far it's mainly a trait you can add if you can. Because the blessing only affects one champion at a time, you really don't get as much value running multiple Dragon Soul units, and instead it's better to just splash 3. And really, you may not always have room to add in the synergy, so beyond the early game, it tends to be rather situational. Sharpshooters are in an odd position right now. They can do well, in fact there are builds that revolve around them like the Tristana reroll build, but overall the impact the trait has on the meta only matters in the early game. Late game you do have Samira, but she doesn't even really care about using Sharpshooter since her entire kit is about getting a big ultimate off. Overall, Sharpshooters aren't in a bad place in the meta, they just lack a consistent identity. Enlightened are also lacking a consistent identity, even though there is a meta build using Talon and Morgana. But those two rely more on other traits than Enlightened. The fact is, the synergy isn't bringing enough to the table to warrant being used outside of a specific comp. Fortune is the same as ever, but it received nerfs that lowered the value you get from winning while not being on a loss streak. That means you may want to try and lose with Fortune to get good value from it, and that's always a risky place to do it, which makes Fortune overall less consistent than it was previously. And the last trait to talk about today is Cultist. Cultist as a vertical trait can do well in the mid game. It's a lot like Warlord where it spikes heavily once you get 6 of the trait. But there's a big issue with Cultist, and that's the fact that they don't have any good scaling carry anymore with Jhin being removed. This prevents the trait from really taking off late game and does hurt its mid game a bit, which is where it's supposed to be the strongest. That's all we have for today's tier list video. Overall, there's a lot of diversity in the meta as every trait is usable depending on the situation. As we mentioned earlier, there was a hotfix, so be aware that the meta may shift in the next few days. Let us know in the comments section below which traits introduced in 4.5 that you like the most. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.